Hi, Misha here. And back when these came in, the so-called Russian capture, German Kar 98Ks, I said once they dry up, they're going to be worth almost as much as most others. But people poo-pooed it. They have import marks, they've been refinished. But the real reason was they were available. They were coming in, they were current. And yes, as they've dried up over the years, they've almost gone up in value as much as other K98s. But the subject of today, the rifle we're going to talk about today, well, it started off in a similar path and has actually become worth more, not less, than more standard examples. Meet the so-called British M1 Garand rifle. Yes, when these were first available at the tail end of the 1950s, collectors of the day poo-pooed them. And even into the 70s and 80s, they weren't really thought of that highly. But in the 21st century, that attitude has done a complete 180, not unlike Chinese AKs too. Why is that? What does this have going for it? Why have collector attitudes changed? And also, why originally was it kind of marked as undesirable? For sure, it's in good shape enough, and we do have an original style rear sight. That's pretty cool. Early style machined trigger guard. But otherwise it looks pretty normal, right? Pretty standard. Well, that is until you do this. Until you look under the barrel. These markings here really lead in to a very interesting story. And also a story about why being here versus here can matter with these guns. So today, let's talk about the British Garand, the Lend-Lease Springfields from 1941 and 1942, and why I picked this one up last month. Besides, I love talking Milsurp, and if you do too, please do talk below and I'll reply. If you could at least liking the video, sharing, subscribing, and if you'd really like to help support us, maybe get some 30-06 ammo, check out the link to Patreon. How about it? This video is of course going to really focus in on British service ownership use of the Garand, the actual history and development, and the very interesting story of John Garand himself, Canadian. That's for a different video. But needless to say that when the US officially did adopt the original gas trap Garand in 1936, it was very ahead of its time, along with the Soviets going to the AVS-36, and Britain did take notice. I should also point out, and yes, that ping was completely intentional earlier, that being a semi-auto is nice, but what held it back was this. Yes, the on-block clip system, the 8-round system, pros and cons to it, but overall I think we can all agree a detaching mag, even if it was only 10 rounds and more or less a flush fit, but you know, early days. But the cartridge inside, the 30-06 M2 ball, also was a thing. In fact, originally they were going to chamber this for an all-new, smaller diameter, higher velocity, .276 Pedersen round, which would have really brought this gun into the 20th century in a real big way. And the cartridge was good, but logistics. The US had so much 30-06 knocking about that they had to kind of revert back to it. And this is actually relevant to the British story later. But yeah, adopted in 36, and the British did take note a little bit. They acquired a few, not because they were really going to adopt it, but because they wanted to evaluate it. So you do see some in British hands in the late 30s, into the 40s, and of course when the war began. But while the US adopted this in 1936, in 1939, leading into 1941, the British went a very different direction. Not only did they stick with the bolt action, they stuck with the another infield, the number 4, which I'm sure you know. And they stuck with their traditional 303 cartridge. And the big deal with it was a rimmed round. Plus, originally that cartridge was meant for late black powder, early smokeless, although it had been improved over the years. So this is kind of where they were at. And these were barely getting into production before the war anyway. I guess I should point out this does have a detaching mag, and it holds 10 rounds versus 8. So I guess in that one way we could consider it a little superior to the Garand. And earlier in the decade they went to a new pattern of sidearm, but they stuck with a revolver. Of course, this is the Enfield number 2 Mark 1. This is Mark 1 Star. But we're the infamous with the whole thing with Webley and Scott. This is chambered for 38-200 instead of 455 Webley or Ely. I want to show you where British armament was. These are kind of the two main guns as they went into World War II. Of course, they had machine guns galore as well. After the Still War, or the Silent War, for a few months, there was the invasion of France in 1940, and things heated up very quickly, culminating in the essentially Apollo 13 of World War II, the Battle of Dunkirk, the evacuation at Dunkirk. And the reason I say that, it was very much an abject failure. I mean, France was overrun, but on the other hand, over 250,000 troops were successfully rescued at great effort and risk. The troops were rescued, but most of their equipment, small arms included, Enfields, older ones, some 4s, revolvers, machine guns, they had to be left behind because of weight savings. They had to get all the bodies on board the ships they could. And just, people move faster. This means by late spring of 1940, it was very much recognized that, well, Britain didn't have enough guns to go around. And, well, the Germans had just overrun France in a record-setting period of time. It was expected they may very well cross the Channel and invade the British Isles next. And even though they rescued a lot of their soldiers, they didn't really have much to give them except maybe some old longbows from museums and some rocks, a few other things. And so they were in desperate need of anything that shot bullets, because who knows when the Germans may be knocking at their door. Thus enter the United States of America. But of course, at this period in time, 1940, they're still nominally neutral. But of course, everyone knows they're leaning very much towards the Allies and doing all they could. In the short term, the White House and Congress worked together and kind of found some loopholes and things in the laws that allowed them to give obsolete and surplus to need guns to Britain and other allies. So the first guns sent over were old World War I era 1917s and 1918 BARs, and a few 1917 water-cooled and 1919 air-cooled machine guns. But it was very much a hodgepodge in condition, varied, and something better definitely needed to be done. So after a brief negotiation and working together, March 1941, what we know today as the Lend-Lease Act was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Roosevelt. And this would allow America to extend loans and ship war material to essentially the Allies. And this would kind of start the whole arsenal of democracy thing. And the initial funds allocated by Congress were $7 million. But that was just the first, and that was a huge chunk of change when you look at how much the U.S. had been spending on their military before the war. Keep in mind, we're still pre-Pearl Harbor at this point. And it would go on from there. But in particular, Britain was the main focus. It would end up being beneficiary, along with other Commonwealth nations, of over 2/3 of Lend-Lease. And they needed guns. Well, just so happens that Winchester and Springfield were producing essentially the most modern, advanced infantry rifle in the world, and really production was just now ramping up to any kind of quantity. With the authority of the new Lend-Lease, one of the first things done on March 27 was to issue the first requisition appropriation of M1 Garands to go to the UK. And this pretty much gave emergency authority, immediate authority to take whatever you need from stockpiles with, reason, numbers, and things, and also acquire a certain percentage from current manufacturing. And this would be codified later on in 1941. I don't actually know the percent numbers, but let's say 5% of monthly production could be allocated towards Lend-Lease deliveries, and of course the rest going to U.S. service. And then of course you start to see manufacturing of Enfields in America by Savage, which was another interesting element to Lend-Lease, and honestly one that was probably more useful to them. But that was the first appropriation, and they would ramp up, and then the second appropriation would come 7 months later, October 28, and kind of just at this point you're mostly taking a slice off current production. From what I've seen, these were Springfield. I don't know if Winchester, anyone out there know if Winchesters were sent over, or was it just Springfield? If nothing else, Springfield was definitely making the lion's share of Garands at this time. And deliveries would soon commence. And how would that go? Well, frankly, as fast as Congress and the President acted, by the time the Garands got over to the UK, the need was not as great. Throughout 1941, the threat of a German invasion would lessen into 1942, when it definitely didn't look possible. In fact, at the end of that year, you would see the invasion of North Africa, followed by the invasion of Italy, and of course culminating in D-Day. So the tables were turning, so that immediate need wasn't there. Another problem, and this was obviously known, but any gun that shoots bullets is better than nothing in an emergency. But .30-06 was not a standard round. .303 was, which actually meant that by British rules and regulations, these guns would have to be easily identified as not being in a standard cartridge. We'll get to that in a minute. Even though soldiers did like them, it wasn't dogged against. They liked the Garand. It just, firing a non-standard round is always a detriment. And of course the U.S. would be engaged in the war itself after December 7, 1941, meaning that the U.S. would need all the Garands it could get. To their credit, for the first 3 months of the war, they continued to send the percentage of Garands over to the UK as previously agreed. But then in March of 1942, the U.S. decided that, okay, any weapon chambered for .30-06, because really no other nation has that cartridge, that's going to be reserved for American forces. And other guns and different cartridges, they can go over there. So this would kind of put the kibosh on the British Lend-Lease M1 Garands, really just a year after the program started. But how successful was it? How many successfully made it over? Between May of 1941 and June of 1942, roughly 38,000 M1 Garands successfully made it to the UK. And of course these would be identical to US service models, at least when they left America. And the first batches were even taken right out of US service stockpiles. Keep in mind, this is a very new gun at that point. And others were just requisitioned throughout production. We don't know exact serial numbers, especially for some of the ones just kind of randomly taken from other sources, but roughly between 300,000 and 600,000, which works well. This one has a 500,000 serial, so towards the end, in fact, it was probably in one of the very final batches sent over. The barrel is Springfield marked, of course, and it's dated 3 of 42, so March 1942, so right around the time of decision changing. There's other markings here that we will get to later on, but yeah, that's the time period that checks out for these guns. So since they would not be receiving near as many Grands as had originally been planned for to go to the UK, well, what did the British do? First and foremost, now we're 2 years after Dunkirk, that had given them time to recover, ramp up production domestically. I already mentioned the Savage Lend-Lease guns, and there were also number 4s made in Canada, like this one here, and they did simplify the design a bit for wartime expediency, so they were already kind of catching up on their 303 infield bolt actions, so that the troops were replacing their losses, which is good because, as I mentioned earlier, they were getting ready to start doing some invading of their own. So that was an old gun, or at least old design that was ramped up, but actually a whole new design came to be because of Dunkirk. The quintessential British machine gun, or at least submachine gun, and yes, YouTube, this is a semi-automatic, only ATF approved, the Sten. They didn't make many Mark 1s. They made quite a few Mark 2s. They made even more later on in the war. Of course, you had the Mark 3, the Mark 3S, yada, yada, yada. But this was a gun that they could just crank out anywhere, anytime, and it would give anyone a machine gun in their hands. Originally really made to protect against the invasion. It would soon find use in paratroopers and other things. So between having the heavy-hitting 303 bolt action and the lighter hitting 9mm but still rapid fire Sten gun, they were pretty well covered. Yeah, they didn't have that kind of gap in the middle of a semi-automatic full power gun, but for the most part they made do. So there just wasn't a need for the Garand, but well, they had nearly 40,000 of them, and they weren't going to just dump them into the ocean. While the British definitely respected John Garand's brainchild, it fired that on standard cartridge. They had a relatively small number. Who knows where replacement parts are? So it meant the fate of other similar guns, including the previous 1917. Yes, they were unpacked. They were modified in some small ways we're about to get to for the British. Many were just left in storage and reserve in depots. Others were loaned out to Home Guard units, very important, especially early on in the war, and very patriotic of many English citizens, even in the countrysides. And many were used for training, drill, practice, that kind of thing. And some were taken by the RAF and used for guarding air bases or airfields or aerodromes, if you prefer, which is kind of a cool term. I don't know if the British Navy ever had any. I couldn't find any. But there are accounts of these being used in combat in World War II, but they're very vague. They're very generalized. If anyone actually has pictures in individual battles, I'm not saying they weren't ever used, but I couldn't find them. Sometimes I think the use as guard guns by the RAF kind of confuses, because some sources claim that they were used by paratroopers. I don't know why they would. They had Sten guns. I think the RAF connection is a little kind of misleading there, but I could very well be wrong. I'm always happy to learn. I think it's safe to say the majority stayed in their boxes. Those that got out didn't leave the British home islands if any did, they were individual units, probably ones working very, very closely with the Yanks, where they could get more ammo and more spare parts. And then, of course, after the war, they were just kind of put back up into storage. Now, speaking of Yanks, when the Korean War kicked off in 1950, some British Marine Commando units did carry the M1 Garand, but these were ones, again, that usually worked very closely with American units. I should also point out that in the Korean War, 30-06 was more of a standard round. For example, Belgian forces used these. But this was pretty small, pretty limited use, and a couple of articles even claim that the guns seen in British hands in Korea weren't even the 38,000 Lend-Lease, that they were actually sourced independently, separately from other places. That's not hard to believe. After World War II, since ultimately 6 million would be produced after Korea, but the U.S. gave Garands to a lot of friendly nations. They were very common, so I could easily see the British getting their hands on a few hundred more just for special forces, commando type units. But they do seem to have seen some British use early on in the first stages of the Korean War. Speaking of Belgium, they used the FN-49 in Korea. Going back to World War II, when Saiv was kind of in exile in the UK, he was working on his self-loading rifle, which had ultimately become the FN-49. When he looked for a chambering, he didn't do 303. That rimmed round and that relatively light loaded round just wasn't good for cycling a gas system. But he didn't go to 30-06 in the UK in 1943-44. He actually turned to 8mm Mauser, 7.9mm, because British were making those rounds already. I just found that kind of interesting, considering they had M1 Garands in their inventory that they didn't make, or at least use 30-06. I guess Saiv just felt that 8mm was better for his purposes. I don't know. Little tangent, just that I would share. But after Korea, well, that was the last gasp of what small service the Garand would have in Britain. So, while it is, yes, a historical footnote, it's a cool one. And I'm quite confident this gun is an authentic British Garand. I'll share with you why, and I'll also share with you why collectors initially poo-pooed these, but now today look for them. So in the second half of this video, we're going to talk more about features and markings and less about history, which thanks for bearing with me, because I've always got to get it out of my system, right? And to talk features and changes, I brought out my Korean War era from H&R HRA. It's actually a lot harder to do that with an empty on-block clip and single-handed than you might think. Anyway, as I said, collectors today kind of value these British guns, and one reason is because of their features and configuration. The M1 Garand, of course, changed over time. Obviously, it started off as a gas trap going to a gas piston. That's a huge one. And the rear sight actually changed during the production run. The earlier Garands sent to Britain, like I said, they were first authorized in March of 41, so some were existing guns. The ones that were right off the production line mostly have barrel dates starting in September of 41, running through around May of 42, again from Springfield. And during that period, we went from the original flush nut to the Type 1 lock bar. And of course, late in the war and post-war, we would go to the style most see without the lock bar, and this also has a longer pinion and other changes. And there's a really good reason for the change. I mean, the flush nut required a tool for essentially locking things down. This you could do by hand, but the problem with the Type 1, it used the short pinion, and you could actually just unscrew the lock bar. You had to unscrew it quite a few turns, but still. So the Type 2 lock bar went to a longer pinion, and it was staked in place. But it came out after this era. This is the Type 1. And then they went to the style we all know and love here. That kind of self-locks, but doesn't require anything. And most all of your U.S. service guns had the rear sights updated post-World War II. But the British ones did not, for pretty obvious reasons. So having the original sights is a big plus, especially if you were lucky and get one of the flush nut versions, but I'm happy this one even has the lock bar. A change done late in the war was going away from this milled machined trigger guard to the stamped steel, the spring steel type. Now this H&R has the older style in it because it's, refurbished gun. That's fine. I thought about replacing it, but I don't know. Doesn't matter. But a lot of Garands during rebuild would have that swapped out. The gas cylinder lock screw originally was a single slot design. Later they went to kind of a two slot, like a Phillips head design. And that was done in 1944 for use with the, M7 grenade launcher? Because of the gas valve. But your British ones would have the single slot. And there were also some changes in the front sight base. There's a lot of little changes in manufacturing styles. And most of your British guns still have their original Springfield parts. Now, I'm not going to say they weren't ever refurbished or reworked. And I'm sure some had replacement parts put in for various reasons. But you're much more likely to find one in an authentic 1941-42 configuration versus getting one from, say, the DCM or CMP in America, or one of the guns, say, brought back from Korea. Not Korea War, but actual, Korean imports like by a century. So that's one reason collectors really do enjoy them. And they typically have the original walnut furniture with the original markings, although the markings are pretty much by necessity worn, like this one. It does have its P. Not too bad. It's still visible, but, it's been handled and moved around over the years. This one has a much crisper P, if I can get my sling out of my way. That's because it's a later stock. And there's also a difference if it's a high or a low stamp. A square versus a circle usually means original versus refurb stamp. Again, I'm enough of a person to, when it comes to actual markings, because I can't see them, they're not my speciality. Continuing on with the stock, flipping it over, the H&R has the DoD stamp, which was a late use. This, it's there, but it's very much kind of worn down. Maybe it was always lightly struck. It has the GHS inspector mark, which was Gilbert Sturt, who was the inspector during the period that these were sent over. So that there should be there. Pretty well standard. The British used a few different types of slings. I don't know if this is original, probably isn't. Trapdoor, cleaning kit. Again, there are a few differences. Like this has a rear band with the kind of notch cut in it. This doesn't. Just little things like that that are pretty cool. And I do like that they have their original furniture, original barrels. And yeah, when they went over to England, they were just straight US guns. But they were immediately modified. Not to beat a dead horse, but yes, 30-06, 7.62 by 63 Springfield, as it was known in Europe, was a non-standard cartridge in the UK. And per military regulations and even law, any gun chambered for a non-standard cartridge had to be readily marked, easily identifiable as such. And you see this with some 1917s that were Lend-Lease and some other things. And the way they did it on the Garand was actually up here. They added roughly a 2-inch strip of reddish paint, color could vary, to say, hey, this is different, jumping in as if they had 303 Garands. It made more sense on the 1917 because they did have P14s, which were 303. Okay, these are all that. But still, it was the rules, so they did. They took them out of the crates and they slopped some red paint on them, and I do mean slopped. And they also caliber marked them. I believe they used a stencil, and it was in a type of black paint. And they would mark them, actually, one of 4 different ways. They would do .30, or just 30, no period, or .300 for 30-06 to denote a difference from 303, because I guess one could argue that .30 could be mistaken for .33, and then finally they did just a 300, no period. At least that's according to the quite good article online over at the NRA. Not much out there on YouTube about these guns, which is why I'm doing the video, but there are a couple of good articles floating around on Google, and I encourage you to go check those out. So you might be wondering why this one doesn't have the red paint. It actually does, but it just faint traces. They put them on, they painted just directly on top of the finished walnut furniture, so it didn't adhere very well. The paint wasn't particularly high quality. And just years of handling and preservatives, grease, cleaning, storage, and of course coming over to the US, most all the paint has been worn off. Some still have it today, original, but others, it's fake. So if you see one of these with red paint, take it for what it is. But yeah, this one has a few faint traces because it was in this area. It's just mostly just been worn off for one reason or another. So those are the modifications that were made in Britain in 1942 when these came around. And that's really about it. And again, we have correct World War II era guns. So why did collectors kind of poo-poo these originally? After all, after the Korean War, the idea of martial arms collecting started to gain steam, traction. It was a slow but persistent process, and people wanted Garands. But keep in mind, this was the Colt M4 Carbine, I would say. This was the current issue rifle in 1955, let's say. People wanted them, but not very many were on the market because the government hadn't turned loose. So you would think one of these would be desirable, but you know, everyone thinks import marks started in 1968. They didn't. Ironically, the very same markings that make these worth something today, under the... Whoops. Notice my finger is nowhere near any of this. Here. Are what kind of dinged it back then. These are its import marks, or rather export marks. Yeah, let's talk about these. Here's the barrel shank on the H&R. And originally that's what would have been on this too. Just the Springfield and the date code, and of course the lot number, all that. So why all the other gobbledygook? Did the British add it in the 40s? No. And I'm sure most of you know that, but you know, it's worth talking about why it's here, how it got here, how these guns got into the country. And of course, when you're talking export imports, you always come back to Sam Cummings. Cummings Import Company, Interarms, was like the Century Arms International of the 1950s, only more reputable. I really first came to know them because of all the cool guns they brought out of Finland, including Lottie pistols, the early Valmets, and really some of the first Mosin Nagants and SVT-40s we saw in America. Cool stuff. But they also brought in new guns from places like West Germany. They had the license for Walther, for example. Yeah, a lot of old guns were Interarms. And Cummings and his company, very interesting. They were also involved in the Armalite and the Netherlands whole thing, AR-10 situation. Story for another day, but just thought I'd mention it. And Cummings was a businessman, and he knew there was a demand for Garands in America. And heck, there was, 30, 40,000, really pretty great condition, sitting in the UK. They didn't want them, they didn't need them. Why not? Well, there were a few hurdles. First and foremost, even back then, the British government was quite restrictive on firearms. Right or wrong, that's what they were. And they would not sell firearms to a foreign entity. There might have also been some weird stuff about Lend-Lease too. I really don't know. Legalities get strange. But they would sell, they could be transferred to an English company. So, Cummings does what any red-blooded American entrepreneur do. He simply bought a British company. And he bought it on the cheap because they were going out of business, or even out of business. They were basically in default. They were in bankruptcy. And it was Cogswell and Harris. I keep wanting to say Cogsworth. Some of you might get that joke. But yeah, he worked on buying them, and the deal was finally inked and done, and he got the deed and everything in 1957. And one of the first things he jumped on were the British Garands, with importation to America in 1958. At least that's when it was started. But that's still not explaining the markings. Well, that's more British law. Before guns could be sold, transferred, they had to be proof tested and all that stuff. And that's what all this gobbledygook means on the barrel. And there were 2 proof houses that did the work, at least on these. You had the Birmingham house, and you had the London house. The London house, or proof house, also known as Gun Makers Company, according to that excellent NRA article, would actually have somewhat simplified markings, as we'll see, compared to Birmingham. But they both tested to the same standards. And the first marking was a nitro proof test, and they just simply put NP. But that's not what this is. This one is a Birmingham, also known as Guardian Company, proofed gun. And they went just a little bit step further, and they put BNP, B for Birmingham. And this is where we start to see the markings really diverge. They use somewhat different proof symbols as well. Next, just like modern import marks, the caliber had to be there. In London, went pretty simple, just putting 30. Whereas Birmingham, they put actually 30-06. And this would extend over to the case length as well. The Birmingham marking is a more precise, more detailed case length compared to the London. Next, we have the proof tonnage markings for the test cartridge. And again, the Birmingham is slightly more ornate, a little more character going on compared to London. And as far as the London house goes, that's the end of it. But according to the article, the Birmingham has a date code marking, but kind of a code marking that includes the date code and the inspector number plus a B for Birmingham. So it's kind of a try thing. So just a whole additional marking that London did not do. And you'll notice, it's on the chamber. That's another piece of evidence showing that this one came from the Lend-Lease batch and not later batches. In addition to what's marked on the barrel, British laws and regulations required that the receiver and bolt also have a proof stamp. Yeah, and you thought U.S. law since 1968 was much. At least we only have one marking. However, if your British Garand doesn't have these marks, don't worry too much. London would stamp a GP proof on the side of the receiver, and Birmingham would use BNP on top of the receiver above the chamber. It might have been the same die as they used on the barrel. And both would stamp the bolt on the right side of the lug area, GP or BNP. But like I said, if yours doesn't have either of these markings or both or whatever, don't worry too much because the requirement wasn't really practical. This one here does have something, a little smudge here, and that's about the best as they could do. The tooling they used was commercial, and they were using it over and over. This is hardened steel, bolt and barrel, very hard. It wore the tools out, and they didn't strike very well. So rarely did the GP or B and P come out clear and crisp. Best case, it was kind of a muddled up, smudgy, and sometimes it just didn't come out at all, just barely denting the surface, literally. So much so that the proof houses seem to have kind of abandoned it at some juncture. Or maybe they just lightly tapped it. So if it's not visible, or it's just kind of like a there, little ping, that wouldn't worry me too much. But if you do see either of those on your bolt or receiver, that's why they're there. Congrats. Yet more evidence it's a British proofed Garand. So yes, these very slight modifications to the barrel, hidden by the op rod anyway, offended the collector sensibility back in the 50s and 60s when these were on the market. As I started the video off, kind of talking about the Russian capture. So many people turned their nose up of them, even though a lot of the rifles were in good shape and still in original, unrefurbished condition too. Now, this being on the barrel is neat here because while Cummings started with the Lend-Lease guns, they were definitely not the only Garands he imported. And in fact, they were a pretty small minority. He found Garands around the world because of the U.S. giving so many away. And he would have them sent to England. That would be where the major depot warehouse would be for the European sector for inner arms. And because they were trafficked through England, they would all have to get the British testing marks, even if they weren't British guns. But these later guns, as far as I know, all of them, or at least the vast majority, were actually marked up here in this area of the barrel, between the rings of the gas cylinder. So they're going to have British proof tons, Birmingham, London, what have you. But if you see them here, that means it probably came most likely from somewhere else. So this is an instance where the import mark being here is a good thing and actually tells us something. Kind of reminds me of another gun where the import mark's actually a positive. Come on, we're talking Birmingham, BSA, and England, and imports. You know I had to bring out one of my favorites just for a second, the L1A1 SLR. And this, having the Century import mark under the barrel from the 90s, actually makes it legitimate, and you know it came in as a proper Title I gun. So in both cases here, the import marks are good. They tell us when and where. Also, I do think it's not a bad idea to have a gun marked with the proper caliber and chamber information, because having an unknown caliber gun is a pain in the arse. You have to slug the chamber and do all that, try to measure the bore. It's a whole thing. So I don't mind that. And I really didn't mind the old 90s style under the barrel markings. Half of them are covered up by cleaning rods with bolt actions anyway. But English guns also kind of found it funny that when they finally did replace the infield bolt action, they went with a semi-automatic version of a rifle instead of select fire. And, you know, size and weight wise, not too far from the M1 Garand. Anyway, moving back again, as I said, Cummings started bringing over Garands in 1958, and they appeared in his catalog, sales catalog, in early 1959. And he had basically two grades, two conditions, you know, rack grade, standard grade, and he wanted $79.95, or mint condition for $89.95. Those numbers sound amazing to us today, but I'm sure you're intelligent folks, you understand inflation. So in today's money, you're talking roughly $840 or $940. Still not bad. Really not. So they were priced quite reasonably. And the competition was Winfield, another importer. The only reason I bring them up, they brought over some Grands, and they sold them for just under $100. They also sold over 15,000 1941 Johnson rifles. And guess what they sold those for? Starting out at $100 for the lower conditions and kind of going up from there. So in the late 50s, Winfield valued Grands and Johnsons the same. Oh, if only that were true today, right guys? I did own a Johnson. Gonna be honest with you, when prices went bananas a few years back, I had to move it. That's kind of the downside of being in my line of work. Speaking of line of work though, well, how did Sam sell these? Just to keep things visually interesting for you, here's some other U.S. martial arms from the World War II period. And while many of these were not available in the 40s, by the 50s and 60s they started to really flood the market, thanks to the U.S. releasing some domestically, like the DCM, today the CMP, and again Interarms, Winfield, and a few others. And Sam Cummings had a retail store in Virginia, Ye Olde Guns, where he would sell outright to the public. That's perfectly fine. He also would do wholesale, and it's kind of fun because he sold them $1,000 to Sears, Montgomery Ward, and others. And Sears is gone. It died pretty recently, but Montgomery Ward's been gone a while. But it was the thing when I was a kid. Again, good businessman. Really was from beginning to end, and that's kind of the story here of this Garand, is just how clever Sam was and how many obstacles he had to overcome to bring these to market, and to bring it to market for $79 a gun retail. I don't know what wholesale price was. Even if collectors back then sometimes poo-pooed these, opting for unmolested ones, today we really like them because of the features we've already talked about. Now, on the market, the Lend-Lease guns, they seem to have been in inventory at Interarms through at least the early 60s. But Interarms would continue to sell $1,000 through at least the mid-70s, even into the 80s. But these would be, the barrel-marked guns. And Interarms would continue, but after Cummings passed away, the company would soon fall apart, effectively going out at the end of the 20th century. There are still some Interarms marked guns in the early 21st century. Winfield had died before, and this really made the way for the importers we know and love today. Century Arms, PW Arms, IO, Royal Tiger. Even importation has its own history, and the British gun here really does emphasize that. And that's really why I wanted it. Most all Garands you find today have been refurbished, especially the ones from American stockpiles. That's not a bad thing. But years and years ago, through family, I ended up with this M1 Carbine in pretty much correct World War II configuration. And I always thought it would be nice to have a Garand similar. And this one checks out for the most part. I'm sure some parts have been swapped out as they wore out. I mean, after all, these were sold, and everything else, civilians might have done something. But overall, it's correct. And what isn't, I can swap. So I thought that was cool. I also find the story cool. I love history. You might have noticed. And it does go well with my other collection members here. By the way, a lot of the Rising stuff actually ended up with Numeric Guns parts up in New York. And by the way, the CMP is still offering 1911 A1s, so if you don't have a military one, Get on their list. Good things. Not plugging them, YouTube. They're not a company. They're a government entity. So, yep. And one more flip. I've done videos on pretty much all of these, including the shotgun here that came from a good friend years ago. It's fun collecting US guns, but you do have to be careful. You really do. Especially when you're like me and you can't see visual markings. So I tend to get guns from trusted individuals when possible, and then I love learning about them. And you'll always have some error. There'll always be something that makes something not 100% perfect. That's okay. That said, though, this Garand does check out. Barrel dates in the range, serials in the range, traces of red paint. We've got the proof marks, including what seemed to be on the receiver as best they could. The features are correct, especially the rear sight. So as best I can tell, it's authentic enough, with the understanding that it might have been reworked a bit in British service, and a US private owner might have done a thing or two for it. It has been test fired. It does run. Still works. But if you're going to fire an M1 Garand, obviously use 30-06, but more importantly, you need military specification M2 ball. If you try to run some other rounds, you could very easily destroy your op rod. It is one of the weaker points of the Garand. So with military ammo, it's fine, but with commercial, other target ammo, don't do it. And on block clips, they are reusable, but understand it's a wear part, so have a few different clips available. Don't just rely on one or two over and over and over. Eventually that spring steel does wear out. Slings are cool, pretty well standard, and of course it has the 2 pocket storage in the butt for a cleaning kit. This one does have it. So another thing to check for, and of course it takes a few different patterns of bayonet, long and short. But yeah, I picked this up, and it did come at a cost. I can't keep everything, guys. I had to sell, and it's already sold, my 1945 February dated Springfield M1 Garand. That was a nice condition Garand, especially the bore. I didn't really want to do it. But between a 1945, nearly end of the war, and an early 42, this is March again, gun with the lock bar sights and all that, plus the cool story, I just couldn't help myself. And I still have my H&Rs you saw, plus a couple of BM59s and what have you. Still wouldn't mind getting an Italian Beretta or Breda Garand in 30-06 one day. But yeah, I just wanted to share, since the story isn't really on YouTube. But again, I plug, there are a couple of really great articles on Google, so check those out, but they're old print articles. So I wanted to bring this over to YouTube. So what do you think? Do the markings bug you? Or are you more like me and they kind of just add to the story? Let me know in the comments. In fact, let's talk about import marks in general in the comments. Good, bad, ugly. Which ones you can tolerate. Which ones you just can't bear. Because we've all got those. Anyway, again, if you'd like to know more about such guns, check out the channel. Do searches. We've got videos on pretty much everything. And if you could, please do like, share, subscribe. If you'd really like to help us out, check out Patreon and or participate in our live streams. In fact, I was cleaning up this gun a bit, getting some Cosmo and crap off when we did our live stream last night. With that, this is Misha. And catch you very soon. Governor.